Over the past few years, interrogation analysis videos have steadily risen in popularity, mainly with the extremely entertaining and educational format of the videos of such channels as Jim Can't Swim and Matt Orchard, the first two interrogation analysis channels I've ever had the pleasure of viewing. Nowadays, there are quite literally dozens of interrogation analysis channels of varying degrees of quality that break down cases, analyze body language, clip out wild or interesting moments from police questioning, or have catchy, what pretending to be blank looks like titles. However, behind it all are some fundamental basics that create the backbone of the structure that is a police interrogation. And while that structure may vary, understanding a little more about what it is, what to look for, and seeing it in action can bring certain interrogations into a different light, and give you a little more insight as to the mindset of an investigator as they question a suspect. In this video, we'll be taking a deep dive into the Reid Technique. If you're watching this, I'm assuming that you have at least a passing interest in interrogation analysis videos, or at the very least find the raw nature of police interrogations interesting enough to watch. And while watching a raw interrogation video might seem like a wild and random conversation that sometimes ends with the suspect confessing all their crimes, what interrogation analysis videos have shown us is that there's actually a lot more going on under the hood. There is a method to the madness. One of the main interrogation techniques that you'll see perpetuated is the Reid Technique. This is one of the primary interrogation techniques that is taught and utilized by over 500,000 police departments and law enforcement agencies in the United States. The actual term, the Reid Technique of Interviewing and Interrogation, is a registered trademark of John E. Reid and Associates Incorporated. We'll take some time now to break down exactly what the Reid Technique is, and we'll see it played out in a real-life interrogation. Keep in mind, however, that although this video is focused on the Reid method and understanding it better, no technique is perfect, and the Reid Technique has come under its own amount of valid scrutiny and criticism, which we'll touch on towards the end of the video. But for now, let's understand what the Reid Technique actually is. The Reid interrogation technique on paper is 9 steps. However, the method as a whole involves 3 components. Factual analysis, analyzing what is known about the suspect prior to the interrogation and comparing that with what is known about the crime. Behavior analysis or interviewing, where the investigator talks to the subject in a much more casual, totally non-accusatory way to establish a baseline normal behavior of the subject before getting into the 3rd component. Interrogation. Interrogation is where the main steps of the Reid Technique take place. All the steps of the Reid Technique are meant to be implemented during the line of questioning, and only when the investigator is reasonably certain of the subject's involvement or guilt. We'll go more into this particular aspect of this method later on, but use of this technique somewhat hinges on the assumption that the person being questioned is most likely guilty. There are very few provisions within this method of actually determining innocence or guilt. It is really on the investigating officer to come to that determination on their own. So what are the steps of the Reid Technique? Glad you asked. Step 1 is direct confrontation. This step can take place at any point after the interrogation has begun. This can be one of the first things the interrogation officer does, or it can happen an hour plus into the questioning. This direct confrontation is meant to inform the suspect that there is unequivocal evidence that points directly at them. At this point, there is an opportunity for the suspect to admit their guilt, but that typically doesn't happen. This step is the setup for the more pointed, direct conversation to follow. Step 2 is shifting the blame, also known as theme development. More than likely, the suspect will not be immediately forthcoming to admit guilt or wrongdoing. So to make it easier, Step 2 of the Reid Technique has the interrogating officer creating a narrative that allows the suspect to begin to admit some guilt, even if the narrative isn't exactly accurate. One example of this would be if someone is suspected of murder. The interrogating officer might create the narrative by saying something like, "Well, in talking to you here, you don't seem like a cold-blooded killer to me. So maybe you felt threatened. Maybe you felt like there was no other option. Did you feel that way?" Now, this explanation could be completely inaccurate to the actual details of what occurred. But if the suspect bites on it and admits to even a small part of the narrative made by the officer, that will make it easier down the line to extract more and more information, hopefully leading to a genuine confession. Step 3 is handling denials. What an interrogating officer doesn't want is for the guilty suspect to garner enough mental fortitude to withstand the pressure of the line of questioning. The more slack you give someone to dig their heels in, the more likely they will continually deny the accusations. And if these denials are not addressed, it's likely that they will get more and more adamant as the questioning continues. Therefore, step 3 of the Reid technique has the interrogating officer swiftly and firmly dismissing any denials from the subject and discouraging them from initiating any further denials. Just an interesting note on this: those who put stock in the Reid technique are more likely to subscribe to the notion that innocent suspects will ignore step 3 and from the very beginning to the very end of questioning vehemently deny any involvement. Guilty subjects will ask for permission to speak or passively look for an opportunity to speak, and when they do so, they will imply their innocence, not outright state it in the way an innocent person might be likely inclined to do. Step 4 is similar: overcoming objections. This is similar to step 3, but rather than an outright denial, an objection would be the suspect justifying why they couldn't possibly be involved with what they were being accused of doing. "I could never kill her. I loved her." Or, "I love my job and all of my coworkers. I would never smash in all the windows of the office before lighting my boss's car on fire and rolling it down the hill." Step 5 is procurement and retention of the suspect's attention, also sometimes known as reinforcing sincerity. The interrogating officer doesn't want the suspect to focus on the punishment, or in all of the ways their life could change for the worse after they admit what they did. Focusing on any such negativity could push the subject further and further away from admitting what they've done. Rather, the Reid technique encourages interrogating officers to focus on why they should admit what they've done. Step 6 is somewhat similar: handling the subject's passive mood. It goes without saying that in some cases, a subject who is being accused of serious wrongdoing, and whose entire life could change as a result of what happens next, might be inclined to simply shut down. The interrogating officer needs to stop them from fully shutting down, and keep them focused on getting to the point where they can talk about the crime. Step 7 is another technique to get the subject even closer to a confession: presenting an alternate question. This typically involves the officer posing two scenarios as to why the subject would have committed the crime, one being more socially acceptable than the other, to try to shoebox the suspect into picking one and essentially admitting guilt. For example, an interrogator might say, "Are you just a cold-blooded killer? Or did things just get out of hand?" Or, "Did you plan this out? Or did this just happen spur of the moment?" Step 8 is having the suspect orally relate various details of the offense. Wanting the subject to essentially verbally confess to details of the crime might seem self-explanatory as far as value, but it's good to note the structure that the Reid technique expects this to take. The interrogating officer first asks very broad, general questions about the offense, and allows the subject to fill in the gaps. After that first pass, the interrogator will then go back again, this time asking more detailed questions, clearing up anything that may have been missed, or clarifying anything that may not have lined up. And finally, step 9, converting an oral confession to a written confession. Very few things trump not only a video-recorded verbal confession followed by a signed written confession when we're talking about someone being convicted and sentenced of a crime. This is the goal of almost every case of which the main suspect is being interrogated by police. They confess. Now, due to the varied nature of people, how they react to certain situations, their mental fortitude, their temperament, and even the varied nature of the officers attempting to implement this method, these steps aren't always implemented in the most direct or obvious or even effective way. Sometimes an officer will only be able to really utilize 2 or 3 of the steps and never quite get the confession they wanted. In order to properly see the Reid technique in action, it would be prudent to look at what might be one of the most famous interrogations of all time, the interrogation of Russell Williams. Now, hold on before you click off the video thinking, well, I've seen this interrogation a dozen times analyzed on a dozen different channels. You're absolutely correct. This is probably the most famous interrogation video on the internet today. And if you are at all interested in this type of video, which your presence here on my channel indicates you are, chances are you've seen this interrogation before, maybe 2 or 3 times even. That being said, we will only look at a small slice of this interrogation, done by the now legendary Jim Smith, and we will not be hyper-analyzing the behavior of Russell Williams or his body language as he's confronted with the terrible truth of what he's done, but rather going through the methods that Jim Smith uses to extract information and how this relates to the steps in the Reid technique. For the small percentage of you who need context, Russell Williams was a former colonel in the Canadian Armed Forces who was eventually charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. 2 women, Jessica Lloyd and Marie France Como, 2 counts of forcible confinement, 2 counts of breaking and entering, and sexual assault. The primary piece of evidence that led investigators to bring him in for questioning were the tire treads on his SUV that matched the tire treads found at one of the murders. A couple of things worked in tandem to make this case and interrogation as famous as it is. Number 1, his high status in the Canadian military. Number 2, the comprehensive documentation of the interrogation, in which he confessed to these crimes in great detail and the methods that were used to get that information. And number 3, the fact that if he wasn't caught when he was, it is most likely he would have killed again, turning him into a full-fledged serial killer. Like I said, we will only analyze a small part of this interrogation as it pertains to the Reid technique. However, if you want to see a full analysis of this case and interrogation in its entirety, I highly recommend you check out the Jim Can't Swim or Matt Orchard videos which cover this case in a more comprehensive way than I could ever hope to. Now, let's begin.
This is getting beyond my control. Alright, I came in here a few hours ago and I called you the way I called you today because I wanted to give you the benefit of the doubt. But you and I both know you were at Jessica Lloyd's house and I need to know why.
We're starting pretty deep into the interrogation, about 40 minutes in. At this point, a number of pieces of evidence have been leveled at Williams that clearly point to his involvement in the murder. They have presented to him his matching tire treads that were found near the home of the victim. They have told him an officer saw a vehicle with the description matching his parked in a field near the victim's home shortly before the murder took place, and they are now showing him footwear impressions that match those found at the crime scene. We can consider this step 1 of the Reid technique, direct confrontation. Jim Smith has shown the evidence to Williams. He is now giving Williams a chance to explain how this happened on his own. He's letting him sit with the evidence presented and seeing if that in itself is enough to get him talking.
I don't know what to say. It's,
Well, you need to explain it because this is the other problem we're having, Russell, okay? Again, these decisions are made by me. Right now, there's a search warrant being executed at your residence in Ottawa. Okay? So your wife now knows what's going on. There's a search warrant being executed at your residence in Tweed, and your vehicle's been seized. Okay? You and I both know they're going to find evidence that links you to these situations. Okay? You and I both know that the unknown offender, male DNA, on Marie France Como's body is going to be matched to you, quite possibly before the evening's over. Okay? This is a major investigation. The Center of Forensic Science is on call 24 hours a day helping us with this. Your opportunity to take some control here and to have some explanation that anybody is going to believe is quickly expiring. Because this is how credibility works, all right? And I know you're an intelligent person and you probably don't need to hear this explanation, but I also know your mind's racing right now, okay? Because I've sat across a lot of people in your position over the years, okay? The bottom line is that as soon as we get that piece of evidence that solidifies it, DNA, okay? As soon as the expert in footwear impressions, the expert in tire impressions calls and says, yes, I've examined those and they're a match, it's all over. Because as soon as that happens, where's your credibility? Where's your believability? You're just another, and again, don't take this wrong, okay? But you can see if you step outside this room in your mind and imagine how people are going to view you, okay? If the truth comes out after the clear evidence is presented to you, when you finally go, okay, I'm screwed now, what are we going to do?
The second step in the Reid technique is theme development. As we said, this is mainly used to develop a narrative that allows the suspect to begin to admit to the crime they committed, whether that narrative is true or not. The narrative, or justification created by the interrogator, is simply a gateway for the suspect to begin speaking on their crimes. For instance, perhaps a suspect stole something. If an investigator were to ask them point blank, "Why did you steal this item?" that might be far too confrontational for the suspect at this point, and they may shut down, or worse, it could trigger a series of hard denials. But if it's presented in a different way, did you feel like that item actually belonged to you? Did you feel like that individual didn't deserve that item? Did you plan on returning it at some point? That is much less confrontational and allows the suspect to slowly start to admit what they did without it being thrust on them all at once. Here, Jim Smith is not providing Williams a justification for what he did. Instead, he tells Williams that the longer he waits to speak on what he's done, the less credibility he has. The less credibility he has, the more others will be able to control the narrative of what happened, why he did what he did, and what his motivations were. You might say that this technically doesn't fit into step 2 of the Reid technique, but think about the goal of the second step. The goal of the second step is to provide a bridge for the suspect to begin to admit what they've done, regardless of the method that's used to do so, whether it's creating a narrative or gently motivating the suspect to speak for fear that they'll lose credibility. At the end of the day, it's meant to accomplish the same goal.
Russell, you know there's only one option. What other option is there?
What's the option?
Well, I don't think you want the cold-blooded psychopath option. I might be wrong. Okay, because don't get me wrong, I've met guys who actually kind of enjoyed the notoriety, got off on it, got off on having that label. Bernardo being one of them. I don't see that in you. If I saw that in you, I wouldn't be back in here talking to you, quite frankly. But maybe I'm wrong. Maybe you got me fooled. I don't know. This is over. And it can have a bad ending where Jessica's parents continue to wonder where her daughter's lying. And I don't know. I mean, obviously, there's a huge search still underway, and it'll continue. It'll continue until her body's found. That might even happen tonight, for all I know.
Let's briefly skip to step 6, which is handling the suspect's passive mood. Passive mood here is more of a general term, since how a suspect will react to being confronted with evidence of a crime they committed will vary. It will vary on the individual. Some might put on a more stoic, hardened appearance, some might become downcast or even begin crying. Others, like Williams, might sit in almost stunned silence as their head races to picture every scenario as well as what their future will look like from this point forward. How the suspect reacts will also depend on the severity of the crime. Was it petty larceny? Was it grand theft auto? Was it assault? Was it murder? All of these things can play into a suspect's passive mood. The way Jim Smith handles Williams' passive mood here is by steadily reinforcing his need to tell the truth and come clean with what happened. He frequently says things like, "This is over," implying that the only option now is to tell the truth, if only for the reason that at least he has a say in the narrative going forward. This also goes to show that with some of the steps of the Reid technique, it is not a linear path. Every interrogation, line of questioning, and case is different and requires different methods, but very often, those methods will line up with the 9 steps that we're going through here in one form or another.
Once that happens, then I don't know what other cards you would have to play. What are we going to do? Is Jessica somewhere we can find her easily? Like, is this something where I can make a call and tell somebody to go to a location and they're going to find her, or is this something where we have to go and take a walk?
So, there's a reason why I left in a lot of Williams' silence in this portion of the interrogation. Here we're going to discuss steps 3 through 5 of the Reid technique. Steps 3 and 4, handling denials and overcoming objections, both have to do with the investigator shutting down any sort of self-defense denial system that the suspect may exhibit. It is well known, especially among investigator and interrogators, that allowing a suspect to repeatedly profess innocence or deny what they did can only serve to mentally bolster them and make it less likely for them to confess at all. So, an investigator would want to make sure that this is snuffed as soon as possible. Russell Williams doesn't do any of that. He doesn't profess innocence, he doesn't defend himself, he doesn't deny the accusations being leveled against him. He's just silent. That is where step 5 comes in. Procurement and retention of the suspect's attention. Jim Smith cannot allow Russell Williams to get lost in his own head and risk him shutting down, at least before he begins admitting to and giving details about his crimes. In order to retain a suspect's attention, the Reid technique suggests closing the distance between the investigator and the suspect. Jim Smith is already fairly close to Williams, as Williams is backed into the corner of the room. Smith also doesn't let silence hang too long before snapping Williams back to reality in a small, subtle way, constantly reminding him that he needs to address what is happening right now, needs to tell the truth, needs to admit what he's done. However, on the flip side, Jim Smith also realizes that it is just as effective to allow Williams to stew in the silence for a little bit, allow him to be overwhelmed by all of the emotions and thoughts flooding through his head. That being said, we will skip ahead a little bit. Most of the 2 minutes or so is Williams sitting in silence as he contemplates not only his next move, but undoubtedly the ways in which his life will drastically change from here on out.
So what am I doing, Russ? I put my best foot forward here for you, bud. I really have. I don't know what else to do to make you understand the impact of what's happening here. Do we talk?
I want to minimize the impact on my wife.
So do I.
So how do we do that?
Well, we start by telling the truth.
Okay.
Okay. So where is she?
Got a map?
That triumphant moment that is and should be the highlight of any channel trying to analyze this case or interrogation. "Do you got a map?" symbolizes the metaphorical dam shattering in William's head as reality finally catches up with him and he realizes the best option for him now is to cooperate. This would fall into step 8, having the suspect orally relate various details of the offense. Now that Williams has finally crossed over to the other side and is willing to share details of what he's done, starting with the locations of the bodies of Jessica Lloyd on a map, Jim Smith can now press a little harder for other details of his crimes, details with which Williams proceeds to be very open about. This would flow into step 9, which is a written confession, one of the ultimate conviction tools.
She did. I tied her up.
What'd you tie her up with?
Some rope I brought.
So she's on her stomach. How are you tying her up?
Just tying her hands behind her back.
Okay. She got clothes on at that point?
Mm-hmm.
What kind of clothes?
Sweats.
All right. You tie her hands behind her back, and then what happens?
I took her clothes off.
Okay. And then what happened?
I raped her.
Now, of course, no technique is perfect and no strategy will work every single time, especially when you consider the wide variety of ways a person could respond to interrogation and questioning. The Reid technique is no different, and has come across its own scrutiny and criticism. We'll go through some of those criticisms now. The first and possibly most apparent is that much of the Reid technique hinges on the investigator's ability to discern what is true and what is false. Unfortunately, an analysis of nonverbal behavior to determine if an individual is telling the truth isn't always the most accurate, and can also vary depending on the person, the situation, and even the time of day or season. Look at this excerpt from one of Stan Walter's talks where he speaks on determining if someone is lying or not. For reference, Stan Walters is an expert in the area of determining truth and deception as it relates to law enforcement and military interrogations.
There's at least 35 empirical studies that show that there is no correlation between eye contact and deception. Do you know that? That's one of the most persistent myths worldwide. There's studies that show that some subjects, about 40% of our population, actually increase eye contact when they're being deceptive. If they look at you more when they're lying than when they're telling the truth. That's one of the first things people write down. Or you probably got this one. Here's another of those myths that's perpetuated horrendously within law enforcement. If you ask that question, look to the left, he's recalling. If you ask the question, look to the right, he's constructing. If you ask the question, look to the left, he's recalling, so he's telling the truth. If you ask the question, look to the right, he's making it up, so anybody who breaks eye contact with the right is lying. Have you been taught that? It's garbage. There's over 100 published studies in the last 5 years alone. Shows there's absolutely no correlation at all to eye movement and deception. But it's thoroughly embedded in federal agencies, in military, and intelligence agencies. I can tell you because I've talked to all of them.
The traditional ways that people believe they can discern whether or not someone is lying, limited eye contact, defensive posture, looking up and to the left or right, even perspiration, can't be fully relied on due to the fact that many times these reactions are variable and change depending on the individual. Richard Leo, a law professor, is quoted as saying regarding determining deception and the effectiveness of the Reid technique, "People are poor at making accurate judgments of truth and deception in general. Behavior cues police rely on in particular are not diagnostic of deception, and investigators cannot distinguish truthful from false denials of guilt at rates significantly greater than chance, but instead routinely make confidently held yet erroneous judgments." The argument against this by those who are defenders of the traditional way of determining truth, as well as the company who teaches the Reid technique, is that these studies simply didn't cover enough actual police interrogations, and rather were done in college labs, where participants had low motivation to hide deception the way an actual suspect of a crime would. A second major criticism of the Reid technique is the fact that many believe it could lead to false confessions. Since the Reid technique is very guilt presumptive in nature, that is, treating the subject as guilty right from jump rather than holding the belief that the subject being interviewed could possibly be innocent, could cause a snowball effect for the interrogator to incorrectly gauge a suspect's guilt, which could motivate that interrogator to pressure the suspect into a partial or full false confession. This can happen via 3 channels. Misclassification. This is when the investigator attributes deception to truthful or innocent suspects based on what they believe is dishonest behavior or nonverbal cues. We went through this in the first criticism. Coercion. This could fall under the category of psychological manipulation. This could be anything from threatening inevitable consequences, making a promise of leniency in return for a confession, denying a subject their rights, or even conducting an excessively long interrogation. Here is a clip from a previous video of mine regarding the I-10 shooter in which police attempt to coerce an innocent suspect into admitting guilt.
It has been scientifically analyzed by our crime lab.
Okay.
And it has been shown that bullets that were recovered from our crime scenes came from that gun.
Okay. Now, is there someone can explain to me how my gun got out of pawn without me?
Absolutely.
Because
We
I have
seized
not.
it. We seized it.
Okay.
Okay. Obviously, we've done a lot of work on this and done a lot of investigative work. Talked to a lot of people. You just saw a couple people that we've talked to today. We've talked to numerous people regarding this. Numerous people that know you. And so we got a feel.
I have no
For
idea
you.
how. I mean, implicated in this, right?
Well, here's the thing. Nobody's been hurt yet.
Okay, but I'm
Okay?
telling you, sir,
Nobody
I have not
got hurt.
fired
Nobody got
a
hurt.
single shot on the freeway.
Well,
I'll
I'm
tell you
telling
what,
you.
I go down the shooter's road and I go down by PIR and I shoot at the water.
Here, Leslie, I'm not going to argue the facts with you.
No, I understand, sir,
So
but
I have the facts in here, okay? And what I'm here is obviously this doesn't look good.
yeah,
okay?
you telling me this is a
And
shock to me, bro?
People do things, maybe they're having a bad day, maybe they're frustrated, maybe things are going on in their personal life.
That's not me.
Well,
I know
your
a gun,
your
a
weapon
gun is
was
a weapon
involved
and
in
it can
it.
hurt somebody.
Your weapon was involved in it. I got video in there. So if you need to see that video to sit there and prove the point, rather than being
Okay, so boss man,
man and just admit.
I'll tell you where I've been. I went to 44th Street and Chandler Boulevard because I have a job there. Her name's Nancy Lutz. We did her yard.
This has nothing to do with
That's
anything
what I
to
did
do.
on
This
the
has
I-10.
nothing to do with your work or any of this.
Okay, well I'm telling you, I have not
You're
fired.
familiar with what I am telling you.
Yes,
You
sir.
know.
Yeah, but I'm telling you, I follow them. I can't follow shit.
I'm not even talking about your Facebook anymore.
I'm
I'm
not
talking. There's no. It's just not out of the blue that you're here, Leslie.
Dude, it
know?
really is because I have not fired
It's,
my
it's
weapon
not
in
out
over
of
2 months.
it's not out of the blue. You're here for a reason. Here's the thing. I know what happened. I just don't know why. And the only person that has that answer is you.
Bro, I can't tell you why because I didn't do it. I don't know how to tell you or what to say here, man.
Well, what I'm trying to figure out is why it happened.
But I don't know what to tell you on that, dude. My gun has been.
Okay, so why would someone who's kind of close to you tell you that they think you are capable of going and doing something like this?
Oh, who's that, my boss? You get a hold of him asking that?
No.
No,
Just
not
saying.
your
You
boss.
just said somebody close to you. Why would somebody close to you sit there and say that you were capable of doing it?
Dude, if you get a polygraph
The
right
evidence.
now, if you get a polygraph right now, I'll pass that shit because I have not.
So you're willing to take a
I'll
polygraph?
fucking take one right now, dude.
Okay. You weren't doing the shootings.
Yes, sir.
I spoke with your wife earlier, and she said that she was with you on the 29th all day.
Mhm.
She said she was with you all day the 30th.
Mhm.
Is that correct?
That's the weekend, man. We're together all weekend.
Well, I'm just asking you. Not.
Yeah,
I
that
think. I
happens.
believe.
Yes,
is
sir.
that the case?
I'm with my wife every weekend.
Okay.
Any day I'm not at work, I'm with
So-
my wife and kids.
So if that's the case, and these are dates that these shootings occurred, and you're telling me that you didn't do the shooting, so are
No.
you
Fuck,
telling?
no, dude, my
So all
wife
right
didn't
then.
do
Well, then look at where I'm coming with this. So somebody had to do it.
It wasn't my wife, it wasn't me, man.
Contamination. Contamination is when an interrogating officer leaks information regarding the case that wasn't made public to the suspect in the interrogation room. After a false confession is coerced out of them, the suspect might then instinctively incorporate that non-public information as part of their confession, which could make them look even more guilty. The argument for defenders of the Reid technique say that false confessions are not a direct result of the technique itself, but the problem really lies in the misapplication of tactics to discern truth, as well as officers who operate improperly beyond the boundaries of the method. As we discussed earlier, Reid is not the only interrogation method out there. There are quite a number of other similarly effective interrogation techniques that are used throughout the world. For example, England uses the PEACE method, which stands for Preparation and Planning, Engage and Explain, Account, Closure, and Evaluate. We won't go into too much detail of this method here, but as a brief overview so you can compare it to the Reid technique used in the US, the preparation and planning phase sees the interrogating officers developing a game plan and objectives for questioning even before they step into the room. The engage and explain phase is where the interrogators establish a rapport with the suspect and explain the reasons for the questioning and what they hope to get out of it. Account is gathering the suspect's series of events. Closure is to prevent an abrupt end to the interrogation, summarizing events and clearing up any unclear details. And evaluate is the post-interview analysis where the interrogators analyze the subject version of events and see if it lines up with the rest of the case. There are a number of other alternative interrogation techniques and methods. Some rely heavily on the interrogator's ability to determine if nonverbal cues indicate dishonesty. Some rely more on the actual verbal communication between the subject and the interviewer. Some are simply a method of procedure for interrogators to use to make sure that the line of questioning flows smoothly. But as effective as these methods are, especially watching them back and analyzing them during the most compelling police interrogations, such as the Russell Williams interrogation, no method works 100% of the time. So, to conclude, I'll leave you with the ultimate combatant to any police interrogation technique.
I understand you said you'd be willing to talk to me about why you're in handcuffs?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Being it is a criminal investigation, obviously you're not free to go because you have warrants for your arrest. I'm going to read your Miranda because it's very important you understand your rights. Okay? You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to talk to a lawyer and have them present with you while you're being questioned. If you cannot afford to hire a lawyer, one will be appointed to represent you before any question if you wish. You can decide at any time to exercise these rights and not answer any questions or make any statements. Do you understand each of these rights I've explained to you?
Yes, sir.
Have you previously asked any other law enforcement officer to allow you to speak to an attorney about this incident? Have these rights in mind, do you wish to talk to me now?
Yes, sir.
I'm sorry?
Say what is it?
Have these rights in mind, do you wish to talk to me now?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
You don't want to talk to me?
I just call him mom.
Okay, you can call your mom at the jail. All right. We'll get you out of here as quick as we can.
Yup. No matter how well researched, how prepared, how skilled of an interrogator someone is, nothing beats an old-fashioned stonewall.